Hi, Roger. Hi, Marlene. Come on in. Are we live? Okay, I just couldn't see it in the back here. All right. Good to see everybody. Welcome to our worship. Can you turn me down just a hair? I want to welcome those who are joining us online too. I know Amy Rohrbaugh said she was going to be watching in Cedar Rapids tonight with her crew at work. So welcome to you up there in Cedar Rapids, and some people here were waving too. So good to have all of you here tonight, and good to have Noel back. We had Brian. We had second team last week. We got the first team back now, so we're good to go. And we've got a much shorter list this week than I ordinarily do, and so we'll see if we finish a little bit sooner. I'm guessing we probably won't, because our main text is a long one, and so the main text is from John chapter 21, and this is the very last chapter of John's Gospel. And just out of curiosity, do you remember the comment I made about the very last verses of chapter 20 from last week? And those of you, read that. Somebody read that for me, where it says if all the things that he said could be captured or something like that. Hi, Betty. Come on in. What does it say?
Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. And when I read that this time, I thought, man, that sounds like that should be the end of the gospel. And that just, I thought that as I was reading it. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's another chapter here, right? There's another whole other chapter in John 21. We're going to be reading a big chunk of that tonight. And then in my study, and as I was looking at some commentaries and stuff like that, there are people scholars who said the same thing. That looks like the end of John. So the question is, like in Mark's gospel, for instance, there's Mark 1:16 verses 1 through 8, and then after that, in almost every Bible, you can look at your Bible and look, it'll say anything beyond verse 8 in Mark 16 is a later addition, because we have early manuscripts that don't contain those verses. And it's almost like that story, Mark 16 verses 1 through 8, it ends with it was our Easter text, actually. It ends with the women leaving the tomb and not saying anything to anyone, right? That's where it ended originally. But if you go and read the rest of it, it talks about, it kind of summarizes things from the other Gospels. When this happened, and then this happened, and it also has some strange stuff about taking up snakes and drinking poison, right? Remember those? Those are texts you don't typically hear very much from our pulpits. Pretty popular in some parts of Kentucky and West Virginia, but not too much around here. But those were added later. And so we have these ancient manuscripts, these ancient New Testaments, that don't have those. So we know that those were added in later. And I thought, well, maybe that's what John 21 is too. Maybe it was a later edition because some later editor thought, well, it's missing something. Well, that's not the case. Almost all scholars believe that it's written by the same hand, that this was John that was writing it, and they compared it almost to an epilogue. So if you've ever been reading a book and it looks like it's over, but it's not really over, because the epilogue is still an important part of the story. And that's what at least one scholar I was reading compared John 21. And they've never found an ancient manuscript that doesn't include this chapter. It's always been a part of John's gospel. So that's just a little bit of stuff that you'd never hear that in a sermon, because there's no point in teaching people that, other than it's just kind of an interesting fact, I think. But it also explains why it sounds like it ends at the end of chapter 20. Okay, so tonight the theme for this post-Easter season is who needs a redo. And so last week we looked at Thomas, right, who said, I'm not going to believe. I'm not going to believe unless I can touch the wounds. I have to see and I have to touch the wounds. And he's given an opportunity to believe, and he does. And he says, my Lord and my God. And he makes this confession that scholars say is the greatest confession that we find anywhere in the Gospels when he says that. And it takes us all the way back to John chapter 1 when it describes Jesus as the Word who was made flesh, God incarnate. And so John kind of comes full circle in that moment when Thomas recognizes that Jesus is in fact divine. He is God. He is the Word made flesh. So he's given a second chance and he takes it. So tonight the person who's going to get a second chance is Peter. So why would Peter need a second chance, do you think?
Because he denied.
Because he denied Jesus 3 times. Absolutely. And so there's an interesting parallel, and you may have heard preachers point this out before, but in our story, in John 21, Jesus asks Peter a question 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And it's like for every time he denied him, he's now asking him, hey, do you really love me? Are you really committed to me? Do you really want to be my disciple? And it kind of hurts. It even says, John even tells us, it kind of hurt his feelings that he had to keep asking him this question, but he did. So there's that connection. But I discovered something, and I love it when I learn something that I didn't see before. Maybe it was right in front of me, and this is one of those things that's kind of was right in front of me the whole time, and I didn't see. There's another connection between the story of Peter's denial and this story that happens in John 21. And the connection is that both events happen around a charcoal fire. And the Greek word is anthrakia, and that's where we get the word anthracite, which I think isn't that another word for coal? I think it might be. Type of coal. I figured Tom would know that. And so there are only 2 places in the Gospels where that particular word is used, and it's in John 18 at the denial when Peter is outside the residence of the high priest Caiaphas, and he's asked, "Aren't you one of those followers of Jesus?" They're around a charcoal fire, and then it happens again in a beach in Galilee. And I just thought, that's an interesting connection. And both of those events happen, and we already know there's a connection between those 2 stories. And so I was tempted to read the Luke story of Jesus' denial because that has the 3 times, but John doesn't for whatever reason. I think the gospel, John would have been aware of probably that story too, but that's not how he tells it. So join with me now in reading the story of Peter's denial in John 18, verses 15 through 18. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. So this would have been after his arrest on Thursday night. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You're not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I'm not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. So little different version of the story than we find in the other Gospels. But as I often like to ask, why do you think it was important that the Gospel writers told this story? Why did they? I mean, if they were, I've always said if they were writing this story now, I'm not sure they would have included stories like this. But why would they tell this story about Peter? It's not a particularly nice story, is it?
I was in a study one time where they were condemning religious leaders for denying Jesus in order to keep their congregation from being slaughtered. and was said that, no, they wouldn't be forgiven. Well, I think it was there to say, well, gee, if Peter could be forgiven for saying something that he knew wasn't true, then he could forgive.
That's it. I like that. I like that idea. I mean, certainly at the time these Gospels were being written, people were being martyred. I mean, that was happening. I mean, that was a regular experience in the early church.
So it was proving that he knew all. He told him ahead of time that he was going to do it, and
He did, yes.
apostles got to hear that, and then he was able to go and say, "I did do it."
So it was basically showing, again, Jesus' foreknowledge, the fact that he prophesied it, showing his authority.
I think it kind of shows a vulnerability or a weakness that we can all relate to as well.
That's where I come down, and that's where you've heard me say it many times, that the Bible tells the truth about the world, and it tells the truth about us, and it tells the truth about Peter. So here is, the rock upon which Jesus is going to build his church. And you might remember, we could even go back and look at that text where Jesus says to his disciples, it's kind of a big moment in the Gospels where Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples all kind of pipe up different things. Oh, some think you're a prophet that's returned, like Isaiah, and then Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And then Peter steps up and he says, "You're the Messiah. You're the Christ." And so it's a big moment. It's his confession of faith, and Jesus as the Messiah, the one who saves. And then Jesus, and this is where it gets interesting, because then Jesus says, "Okay, now here's what that means. That means I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and they're going to arrest me and torture me and crucify me, and I'm going to die. And on the third day, rise again." And Peter, you might remember, said, "No, you're not. I'm not going to let that happen." And so here's the one who just, and Jesus said, "You're the rock. I'm going to call you Peter. You're the rock upon which I will now build my church." Petra, the rock. And then a verse later, Jesus is saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan, because you've set your mind on human things, not on God things." Because that's not the plan. So once again, we have this example of Peter's vulnerability, his humanness, and it's something that we can relate to. Can you imagine if we opened up the Gospels and every story of the disciples showed them acting perfectly? I mean, making every single choice, heroic, courageous choice. Can you imagine how different the church would be if that were the case? I'm just not sure we would relate to it. It would probably read more like a legend or mythology, wouldn't it, if we were reading it that way? But the Bible doesn't read that way. The Bible tells the truth about people. Something else it does is we're going to see, especially as we move into Acts and some of the stories of Paul and Peter in that post-Pentecost period, right? After the Holy Spirit descends on them, is we're going to see a big difference between Peter here, even here, and a couple of weeks later, after the Holy Spirit is poured out on them on Pentecost. So we also going to see a big difference there. Now, tonight we're going to see in our main text. So this is the main one. If you want to turn to John 21, we're going to kind of look at this, take it slowly, a verse at a time, almost, as we go through it. And there's kind of two stories that are happening in this long text. One is a story about fish, and the other is a story about sheep. Two major metaphors that come up again and again in the Gospels, in the Bible, really, but especially in the Gospels. And so just kind of keep an eye out for that. So let's take a look at John chapter 21, beginning at verse 1. So this is the third appearance to the disciples. This picks up exactly where we left off last week, right at the end of chapter 20 with the story of Thomas, and now we're picking up a little bit later. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. So let's just pause there for a second. Where are they now? So when Jesus appeared to Thomas, they were back in Jerusalem still, right? But he had said, I need you to go where?
Galilee.
I need you to go to Galilee. There you will see me. So what is the Sea of Tiberias? It's the Sea of Galilee. It is, that body of water has so many different names, it can get really confusing. The Sea of Galilee is also the Sea of Tiberias, is also, there's another name. Anybody know what it is? Lake Gennesaret. You've seen that, read that before. Lake Gennesaret. Gennesseret, something like that, I think. That's how it's spelled. But you'll run across that. Same body of water. I used to have a professor who, when he was talking about Bible history and Israel's history, he had this really rudimentary map that he would draw on the chalkboard of the Holy Lands. And I think I've actually done a slide of this before, but he would draw a little circle up here, and then he would draw a line, straight line down, and he'd draw a big circle down here, and then he would draw kind of a big curving line right here. Okay? So this little circle up here is the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, Lake Gennesaret. It's a big freshwater lake. What's this line? The Jordan River. And what's this big circle down here?
Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea, right. What's this big circle here, or this big curving line?
Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean Sea, the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Promised Land. This is the Holy Land, Israel. Down here, so a little bit closer to the Dead Sea, is Jerusalem. Okay, but Jerusalem and Jericho's clear down here. Jericho's clear down by the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is straight up almost. From Jericho to Jerusalem is almost straight up, almost like you're going up a mountain. Here's Jerusalem. And Galilee's clear up here. And this is where Jesus grew up. This is where we're at right now. So I don't know if that helps you, but it always kind of helps me when I'm thinking about where things are. Are we up by the little circle? Are we down, 3/4 of the way to Jerusalem? Or are we clear down at the Dead Sea, at Jericho, or somewhere in between? But Jesus spent most of his time in Galilee. That's why he said, you need to go back there. And we're back there now. Also, anybody know who Tiberius was? I had to look this one up. I had an idea. He was an emperor. He was the son of Augustus Caesar, who was emperor when Jesus was born, right? And then a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. And Mary and Joseph went back to their hometown so that they could be counted, so they could be taxed. Augustus they call him the first Caesar. I really need to bone up on my Roman history because I started reading it, and it reads like a TV show. With Mark Antony and Cleopatra and battles and drama and all kinds of crazy stuff that was going on in terms of leaders and people, sons and fathers killing each other and uncles and all of that kind of stuff. But Tiberius, his name was Tiberius Caesar Augustus, was the second Roman emperor. So Augustus was the first. Julius Caesar preceded Augustus. And they called Julius Caesar a dictator, but I don't think he was an emperor. So it must have been, that's the part where I'm a little unclear, why Augustus was considered the first emperor, and he started his reign in 14 BC and ruled earlier than that. Tiberius ruled from 14 AD to 37 AD, and Augustus ruled before that. Anyway, it was his stepfather, actually. Okay, verse 2. Gathered there were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Okay, so let's just take a look at what do we know about these guys? What do we know about Thomas? We've already talked about Simon, Peter. What do we know about Thomas? We just talked about him last week.
Everybody else was hiding and Thomas wasn't there.
Right. So one of the things we said last week was he may have been the most courageous among them because he was not afraid to go out, get resources, get food. Who knows? But we do know that he doubted, that he wouldn't believe until he saw for himself. What do we know about Nathanael? It's a kind of a one-liner in the Gospels, but it's in there.
He went and told his brother that he found the Messiah.
Right? But he's also the one that said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Because it was, I told this story, I made somebody mad once because I compared Galilee to West K here in Keokuk. That it was, people looked down on certain parts of the country. They said, can anything good come out of Galilee? Can anything good come out of the south side of Chicago? Can anything good come out of East St. Louis? Can any, name the right, that's how people saw Nazareth and Galilee. They called it Galilee of the Gentiles because it was, this wasn't just a strictly Jewish population. There were all kinds of people that lived up there. And you remember one of Jesus' miracles goes across the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, Lake Gennesaret, whatever you want to call it, and there's a Gerasene, the demoniac that's living in the cemetery. Remember the story? And he says, asks him what his name is, and he says, I am Legion. And Jesus sends the legion of demons into what? Pigs. You think you'd ever find pigs in Judah? Anywhere where there were Jews? Not in a million years. No, that tells you right there the fact that there was a herd of 1,000 pigs, or however many there were, tells you that you're not in Jewish territory anymore. And it's also interesting that that's one of the few places where he does something like that, and then he tells the man, go ahead and tell your friends what happened. Because almost every other time he says, no, don't say anything to anybody, because they're not going to get it yet. But he did not have that fear among the Gentiles. Did not have the fear of them telling other people the good news. But he did with the Jews, because he thought they're going to get it wrong, and they did. They kept getting it wrong. Okay, so that's Nathanael. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? What about James and John? The sons of thunder. The sons of Zebedee.
They were really close to Jesus.
They were. They were very close to Jesus. But there's the story that always comes to my mind is Brian preached on this text a month or two ago. As they're going into Jerusalem for the last time, they slide up to him and they say, hey, when you come into when you ascend the throne, can we sit next to you, one at your right, one at your left? Can we rule alongside you? See, that was how the Jews kept getting it wrong, right? They kept thinking, oh, Jesus is going to be the new king of Israel. He's going to be a king in the line of David. He's going to be a military ruler. He's going to kick Rome out of here, and it's going to be great. We want to rule alongside him. So basically, what we see is we have a kind of a rogues gallery, because the disciples were all a rogues gallery. They were all people who were flawed and made mistakes. Okay, verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out, got onto the boat, but that night they caught nothing. All right, so a little speculation here. These are questions that we can't really know the answers to. We can just guess. Why do you think they went fishing?
They went back to work to do their...
Yeah. Was it unfaithful of them to do that?
They just thought it was over with. They didn't have...
Okay.
Well, my brother and dad think it's fun.
Right, right. It was a job for them.
Bills or something? Pay taxes.
You know, a couple of things I read said, you know, this was how they made their living, and they had the Gospels tell us they had rich widows that supported them financially, right? I mean, Jesus, they had to eat, they had to have some funds. I mean, they got along pretty, you know, pretty frugally, but they had people that were their, what's the word I'm looking for? Their patrons, right? They had people who.
Why weren't they called disciples?
It's a good question. They were called followers. I mean, they're talking where it says there were, you know, followers of Jesus that were waving the palm fronds, that were, you know. That's a good question, though.
They were called disciples.
Well, they may have been called disciples, yeah, they may have been. And maybe it was just that there were the 12 that were the closest to him, you know. Of course, that number 12 is a significant number in Judaism and in the Bible. So, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples, 12 represents community, represents the church. It's an important number. 12 times 12 is 144. The new Jerusalem is going to be 144,000 by 144,000. It's perfect community, perfect community. That's what that represents. 12 times 12 times 12 times 12. So not really necessarily a bad thing that they went fishing. They went back to what they knew. They had to pay their bills. You know, plus, and this is important to remember, Jesus told them to go back to Galilee. And they did. So they're there waiting to see him. Verse 4. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Okay, let me ask you this. How is this similar to some of the other post-resurrection experiences that we know about, that we've read about? How is it similar?
On the way to Emmaus, they
didn't recognize him, did they? Yeah. So that happened. That story is from Luke, and that happens on Easter afternoon. So the afternoon of Easter, there's two disciples, and they're leaving. They're getting out of town, right? They're getting out of Dodge, and like Tom said, they were called disciples. They weren't two of the 12, but they were called disciples, and they were going to their home in Emmaus, and they're going along, and they're talking about everything that just happened in Jerusalem, and they're joined by a stranger, and the stranger starts opening up their minds and reminding them of all these prophetic sayings of Jesus, and then later in the how was he revealed to them? Remember?
called their name.
Well, no, that's another story.
They broke bread.
And they broke bread. And suddenly they realized when he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, it was revealed. So they invited this stranger to eat with them, and then he serves them bread and wine, and suddenly their eyes are open. But this is a consistent theme in all the post-resurrection experiences or encounters that they have. So they don't recognize him at first. When Mary saw him in the garden, she didn't recognize him, said he was a gardener, until he said her name. The disciples, even when the first time that he appeared, it doesn't sound like they recognized him until he showed them the wounds in his hands, right? And then Thomas said he wouldn't believe unless he touched him. Now, it doesn't say that he actually had to follow through with that, but so yeah, there's a consistency to that. So verse 5, Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." This was interesting. I read a number of different things about this greeting, and some people thought that it almost sounded like he was speaking down to them by calling them children. You could almost see how that would be. These are grown men he's talking to, but I think my take on it is that it was more or less an informal greeting. It'd be kind of like, hey guys, hey buds, have you caught any fish? It'd be like if you were the head of a household and you were looking for food for groceries for your family. Do you have anything I might be buying, right? That's kind of that would have been the take on that. So I just thought that was, it's an interesting greeting there, but it was an informal, kind of a casual greeting. And of course, they answer no. So Jesus says to them, cast the nets to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. Okay, so they'd been out all night, hadn't caught anything. They throw their line, they follow the stranger's advice, throw it over the other side of the boat, and now they've got so many fish they can't even haul it in. Does that remind you of any other stories?
When he called them.
When he called them, yes. That's what we're going to look at next in Luke 5. So go ahead and turn to Luke 5, and we're going to read that story. How many of you have seen the first season of The Chosen? You seen it? It's so good. It's so good. If you get a chance to see it, and so this scene of the call with the boat, and I mean it starts off in Capernaum, which is in Galilee, on the Sea of Galilee, and they're in big trouble because they're not catching fish, and they've got this big tax bill. And that's how Matthew kind of comes into it, and it's really interesting how they do it. Well done, better. It's the best Bible drama kind of thing I've ever seen. I'm not one that really is into those kinds of movies typically. I don't think they're ever done well. This is done well, but this scene is a really dramatic, powerful scene where Jesus, and it's the moment where they all realize this guy's for real, because he'd been around for a little bit and had several encounters with each of them, but if this is the moment when he also pays all their bills, frees them up to follow him. And that's what happened. I mean, they were in trouble, and suddenly they've got more fish than they can handle, and now they're able to pay their bills. They're in good shape. So interesting how they handle that. But let's go ahead and take a look at Luke's version of this call. Once while Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, there it is. There's the third name. So anytime you see this, don't be confused. It's the little circle up here, right? Jordan River, Dead Sea. We're clear up here in the north. And the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God. He saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee. Well, there they are again too. Yeah, they were there. Who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. So, isn't the symmetry of these stories awesome? That they start with this amazing miracle, and who better to appreciate, boats overflowing with fish than fishermen, for whom this is their living. And then at the end, and then of course the story also does something else. What is Jesus telling them about fishing here? About what their calling is going to be now?
Fish for people.
You're going to fish for people. So you thought this was your job, but that really this was something you do to pay your taxes and pay your bills, but that's not your job. From now on, you're going to be fishing for people. So that's the fishing part of it. And And then, so we're going to go back now. We're going to go back to verse 7 in John 21 and keep going. All right, it says, that disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, who do we think that is? Whenever you see that in John's gospel, it's kind of an interesting. It's John, yeah. Almost everybody agrees that this was John's kind of deferential way of talking about himself. That disciple whom Jesus loved. He's the one that outran Peter to the tomb. Remember that? He outran Peter to the tomb, and when he looked in and saw it was empty, what happened? He believed. He believed immediately. He didn't have to even see the risen Christ. That's how special John was, or at least he was pretty special in his own mind, because he keeps talking about how close he was to Jesus again and again in this gospel. So anyway, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So again, he's the first one to recognize that's Jesus on the shore. Soon as he saw those fishing net full of fish, that has to be Jesus. Okay. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the lake. That's always kind of cracked me up, that that he would put his clothes on to jump into the water. You'd be surprised how much commentary is given to things like this. So I won't burden you with all that, but it's just interesting. A lot of scholars say he probably had on a loincloth, the minimum amount of clothing when you're fishing and you're dealing with a lot of water and stuff like that. You don't need wet clothes. and that he probably had on a tunic or something like that he wouldn't want to leave in the boat. So he put it on, jumped in. So may or may not have been completely naked, but that's what it says. All right. In verse 8, but the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw, what? A charcoal fire. There it is again, with fish on it and bread. So only two places in the entire New Testament where that phrase is used, charcoal fire, is in John 18, when Peter denies Jesus, and again in chapter 21, when Peter's given a second chance. It was at a charcoal fire. Do you notice anything about the fact that, I'll just go ahead and say it. They've just caught a bunch of fish, right? But Jesus isn't asking them for fish to cook, is he? It's already cooked. So he is providing for them. Can you think of another time when Jesus provided bread and fish?
Some fish, when he was preaching.
Feeding of the 5,000, right? Yeah. Another big, important story in the Gospels. A really important story in the Gospels, in all the Gospels. The feeding of the 5,000, where he takes the bread and he breaks it and he divides it and he feeds the disciples fish. And there's, I heard that, was there 5 loaves and 2 fish, I think? Isn't that right? 5 loaves and 2 fish. How many is that? 7. Is that a significant number in the Bible? Yeah, it's big. It's God number. The Jewish people, numbers are significant. Numbers like 12 and 40 and 3 and 7, and 6. These are all significant numbers, but 7 is a really significant number. Why is it a significant number?
Created the world.
Yeah, and he rested on the 7th day. It's a God number. And I had heard a preacher once say, the disciples come back to Jesus, and they're like, all we have is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's all we have. Here they are. They're holding up 7 things, 7 items, and they can't see. And he's like, how can you not see that we're going to be okay? All right. So verse 10. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them, and though there were so many, the net was not torn. All right, what do you think's going on there? One thing, it shows how strong Simon Peter is, right? He says he wrangled that net by himself. So Simon Peter was he was a tough guy. He could do that by himself. What about this number, 153? What do you think's going on in that? So there's all kinds. You'd be surprised how many theories there are. Let me just read some of them. Okay. So Augustine, St. Augustine, you ever heard his name? He was a famous theologian from way back. He thought that he knew that the number 153 is the sum of the numbers 1 to 17. So if you 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, okay, all the way up to 17. Just keep adding those numbers up. Adds up to 153. And he would say, which points to the number 17, and that's the number of the commandments and the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. That was Augustine's theory. I think that's taken it a little too far, personally. That's one theory. Some have noted that 153 is the added numerical value of the Greek words for Peter and fish. And that is something that the Jews do. There's Hebrew especially, but Greek too. Every letter has a numerical value. You may have heard me talk about the number 14 is my number. That's the number of David. The numerical value for DVD, because they didn't have vowels, is 464. DVD. David, which adds up to 14. And that's a significant, 14 is one of those significant numbers in Judaism. It means David. When you hear 14, it's like in Matthew's gospel, at the beginning, you've got 14 generations between Adam and Abraham, and 14 generations between Abraham and the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations between the exile and the birth of Jesus. 14, 14, 14. David, David, David. And who is Jesus in Matthew? The son of David, right? He wants everybody to know that. That's just one example of that. Okay, so 153 is the added numerical value of the Greek words for Peter and Simon, or Peter and fish. I think that's a stretch. Some ancient writers, such as Jerome, believe that this was interesting, that there were 153 different types of fish in the world. That's how many that people had identified at the time John was written. And that this catch represented a full harvest of the entire world. In other words, I kind of like that. So every kind of fish, 153, would have been common knowledge that there were 153 different kinds of fish in the world. Maybe. Some thought that 100 stood for Gentiles, 50 stood for Israel, and 3 stood for the Trinity. That would add up to 153. And others say, you know what? These guys were fishermen. They knew how many fish they caught. Even to this day, I went ice fishing this past winter, and you ask any of these guys, and they're pulling them out one right after the other. How many did you catch? 35. 42. I mean, they always know exactly how many fish they caught. So I think one way to read it, probably the safest way to read this, is that they just caught a bunch of fish. And it was miraculous because they'd fished all night and hadn't caught a single thing. And now they caught a whole bunch. Okay. So that's just I think that's an interesting aside. I got to keep going, get finished here. Verse 12, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. Now does that language sound familiar? He took the bread and gave it to them. What does that sound like to you?
Last Supper.
Sounds like the Last Supper. There is no Last Supper in John's Gospel. Not like we were used to reading it in the synoptics. And one guy was reading said, this is the closest thing that we have to the Last Supper. It talks about the blood and the bread, and I'm the bread of life, and we have all of that in John, but no real description of the Last Supper. But this is about as close as they come to that. And something else that was interesting that I read is that some scholars think that there may have been a tradition in the early church where new believers had a meal because fish represented new believers, that like post-baptism or something like that, they would have had a meal of fish and bread. You know, basically what we see described here. And of course, what was one of the ancient symbols? The ichthus. You've seen the ichthus, right? That's the fish. That's the fish, yeah. Okay, verses 14 and down. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. So what do you notice about how he's addressing Peter here?
Is that his old name?
That's his old name. Yep. Simon, son of John. What do you know? Do you love me? Do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my lambs. A second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. So what's Jesus asking of Peter here?
Go out and teach about.
Okay. Yeah. So we started out with a fish story, and now we've gotten into this sheep story, and which is of course another big metaphor, especially in John's Gospel. And so let's take a look at this text here, because we're going to get into the whole idea of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and but apparently Peter, and by extension us. So we're fishermen, but it sounds like we also have some responsibility for sheep care too, doesn't it? According to this, we've got to be doing both. That's how I'm reading it. Okay, let's take a look at John 10, verses 11 through 15. And we're getting almost to the end here. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for his sheep, for the sheep. So what does it mean for us to take care of the sheep, of his sheep? Remember, he says, these aren't your sheep, these are my sheep. But he's given Peter, he says, you got to take care of them. You got to tend to them. You got to feed them. What does that mean for us?
I think he wants them to feed them with knowledge.
Okay, yeah. So it's one thing to bring them in, right? That's the fishing part, right? To bring them in, but you can't just bring them in and not do something with them. You've got to teach, you've got to guide, you've got to help, right? You've got to encourage. There's all kinds of things we have to do to take care of these. They're not fish anymore, now they're sheep. You know, I think I'd rather be a sheep than a fish anyway. And so, what do we know about Peter's future? So this is what Jesus is telling him. His feelings are a little bit hurt because he feels like Jesus should already know this. But what does Peter do next? What do we know about Peter in the next? What do we see happening in his life in the next month or two? Let's say.
They follow Jesus.
They do. And he steps out, and he does that, right? I mean, he stands up and preaches on Pentecost, and how many came into the church that day? You remember? 3,000. 3,000. So they were fishing, and they were tending the sheep. And Peter absolutely is faithful to this challenge of Jesus here. He's absolutely faithful to that. So he's given that second chance, he's given that redo, and he does it. He absolutely does it. And, up until Pentecost, there's some question about whether or not he would actually follow through, because he has failed consistently again and again and not done the right thing and thought the wrong thing or whatever. But he does follow through. And then the last verses here, verse 18. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fashion your own belt and go wherever you wished, but when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, follow me. I've always thought that this is kind of a good image for aging gracefully. Has anybody ever else read that verse and thought that? Is that not what happens to us when we get old?
Yeah, but that don't sound graceful. Not being able to take care of yourself, being drugged somewhere where you don't want to go.
Is that not what happens often?
Seems that way.
Yeah. It seems to me like, Jesus is just laying out what can be a little bit of a hard truth here, and that is, yeah, you have independence now, and you have power and authority, and you can do stuff, but there's going to come a time when you don't have that anymore. And it seems to me like we should read that and say, that's going to be true of me too. And we should be willing to humble ourselves enough to accept that. That's hard for people. Hard for lots of people. And they just fight it and fight it and fight it. That's not graceful aging. Aging gracefully is when you can say, okay, I got to stop driving now. I got to stop thinking that I can get up on a ladder and clean out my gutters. Whatever it is that you need to stop doing, Paul at one point said, I need to get smaller so that other leaders can get bigger. Do you see the grace in that, in the humility in that? Paul was a strong leader, but he said, I need to be smaller so that Apollos or whoever it was can step in and be the leader now, right? And that can be hard for people. But I think that's kind of what's going on there. Also, we know we don't have a biblical description of what happens to Peter, but we have a legend. What's the legend of around his death?
Around Peter?
Around Peter.
He was crucified but upside down.
Yep. So we know that he was martyred. He was probably in Rome, that they were going to crucify him, and he didn't feel like he could be crucified in the same way Jesus was. And so he requested to be crucified upside down. And that's traditionally how we understand that he died. So he followed Jesus faithfully. And then the very last verse, he says, after this, he said to them, follow me. And that's what they did. That's what Peter and James and John and all of them did. They were faithful. They followed. And so in the end, that's what it's about. It's what it's about for us too. It's about following Jesus. It's about fishing, and it's about taking care of sheep. There you go. There's Brian's sermon for Sunday. I should just give that to him, don't you think? Because he's preaching this week. So, all right. Next week, we won't be having We won't be having our regular Bible study because it's our all-church cookout, and that starts at 6. And then we're going to we'll be meeting every Wednesday night through May, and then we'll wrap things up, and we won't meet June, July, and August. Then we'll get started back up again in the fall. So let's have a closing prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you that through the words of the Bible we can grow in our understanding of you and this amazing story of which we're now a part. We thank you that we get to be a part of this drama that's playing out in our world, and that you want us to be a part of it, that you've given us the same instructions that you gave to Peter and the other disciples, and that now that's our job to do, and that there'll be others that follow us that will continue that work. So just be with us as we go forth from here tonight, for we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.